I'm Tim, welcome to What You Want, and thanks for logging on. Today, we're looking at the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Perpetual Calendar, 39mm, 18 karat rose gold. This is reference 26252OR, and like all watches featured on our YouTube channel, this AP is available for immediate purchase and delivery on our retail website, whatyouwant.com. If you like getting the latest news, views, and reviews in daily video format, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, What You Want Inc. Now, in 1981, less than a decade after the debut of Gerald Genta's original Royal Oak, the very first complication to be associated with the increasingly iconic model was the Perpetual Calendar, and to this day, these watches represent an important chapter in AP history and an integral part of the Royal Oak catalog. This example, 18 karat rose gold with an alligator strap, is a completely different look and a completely different fit than the traditional full bracelet stainless steel Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. Still ultra thin, still beautifully chiseled and hand finished, it nevertheless has a radiant warmth to it that's completely singular within the AP catalog. Now you can see on my wrist 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters in circumference. The watch wears unlike any other Royal Oak. For one thing, the flatness of the traditional JLC-based caliber 2120, even a modular configuration of it, remains exquisitely low in profile, only 9.3 millimeters thick in total. That's for a moon phase Perpetual Calendar automatic wristwatch. It sits exceptionally low, and as you can see, the traditionally octagonal Royal Oak bezel does have a little bit of polished tumble home at its upper lip, so a dress cuff, a tight sleeve will flow up and over this with ease. Now similarly, from an ergonomic standpoint, the interaction between the strap and the lugs is visually tapered, nicely integrated, but completely different from a fit standpoint than the bracelet, because this minimally bolstered alligator strap is exceptionally supple and flexible. And whereas the bracelet wants to flare out and almost extend the case with virtual width, this wonderfully flexible alligator strap will turn and bend straight down around the curvature of a small wrist. So if you love the look of a Royal Oak, this is possibly the ideal option if you just can't get along with the stiffness and the flare inherent in the linked bracelet. Now, everything that touches the skin is of the highest quality. It also speaks to the art design inherent in every Audemars Piguet product. Beautifully built, the attention to detail is second to none. Consider, for example, these square scale alligator patterns on the lower portion, the longer portion of the strap, and then on the shorter upper portion, a completely different scale pattern. Just a nod and a wink to remind you that AP is investing every square centimeter of this watch with thought, with inspiration, and creative nuance. Now, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak is most often seen on a bracelet, so that look, the bracelet that turns into a watch at the bezel, is somewhat broken up by the contrast of the alligator skin. It's definitely a different aesthetic, but what it brings is uniqueness, because you're used to seeing the offshore on a strap, but rarely seeing the traditional Royal Oak on a strap. Even among AP models, this is one that's going to turn heads and provoke second glances. Because it is so counterintuitive, it's definitely a double take kind of watch. Now the single deployant, you can see both swing arms featuring the AP logo, is of appropriate quality to the rest of the watch. You can see each element beautifully finished. There is nothing that's raw. There is nothing that's unfinished. Even the underside of the buckle is a high polish. When I speak of attention to detail, I mean things like the soft calfskin underneath the strap, the differing patterns of the alligator scales on the top, and of course the way that the plots and the tapered lugs themselves nevertheless integrate with the same precision as though this watch were on the traditional bracelet. But moving inboard from this unconventional and beautifully made combination of deployant and leather strap, you can see that all the traditional merits of the Royal Oak are present in force, namely a completely hand-finished Royal Oak style case. Octagonal bezel, inset white gold hexagonal bezel bolts. They stand out more on this watch. Because we're used to seeing this combination on steel watches, the contrast between the polished white metal of the white gold bolts and the steel of a traditional Royal Oak isn't as great as the contrast between the warmth of the brushed rose gold and that almost sterile chill, that coolness of the polished white gold bolts inset within. So this watch has more contrast, not just because of the contrast in metal tones, but because of the contrast in finishes. Now it's more dramatic in gold. Gold just has a luster and a radiance that you don't find with steel, so you can see these beautiful hand chamfers along the flanks, high polish, whereas the tops of the lugs, as well as the tops of the case and the flanks of the case, are beautifully brushed, so you have that transition from brushed to polish, itself tapered as it moves toward the bezel, back to brushed, polish on the flanks of the bezel, brushed on the tops. Moving inboard, you can see just as much attention to detail invested in the dial. Now, it's a traditional Royal Oak tapisserie design, so a hobnail or waffle cut. What you can't see from this angle, but you can from this angle, is the beautiful polished inner bezel, completely mirrored. It's a degree of polish that visually extends the dial from every angle because it captures the light reflected by this silvered tapisserie and it amplifies it, reflecting it back outward. It almost looks as if there's a cantilever. It almost looks as if the dial is extending underneath the bezel as a result of all that luster, all of that gloss brilliance reflecting back out from the polished wall of that inner bezel. And the dial itself is even more intricate and more beautifully detailed than the iPhone could ever represent. So I want you to go to our website and check out our listing for this watch so you can see the texture, the intermediate textures of the tapisserie. Now this watch, being purchased in 2011, features a dial that was still made at the time by Stern Creations, a company originally founded by the Patek Philippe Sterns. We are talking about that same horological continuity, so you've got remarkable pedigree within this watch, with a JLC-based movement, with the Audemars Piguet tradition of fine finish, with a design by Gerald Genta, and a dial crafted by part of the Stern family empire. It's almost like a tour of Switzerland's high horology highlights in a single watch. And each one of these little squared waffle cuts features a texture on its top as well as a texture in the trough between it and its counterparts. There's unbelievable detail in the high-resolution images of this watch on our website, watchyouwant.com. Each of the indications of the Perpetual Calendar features a gorgeous rose gold chapter, and you can see the shine and the reflectivity of that rose gold around the outer circumference of each one of those dials. Likewise, the fully loomed hands and indices are all 18-karat rose gold to match the case. So while this watch is very formal in its style, it nevertheless has some of the qualities of a sports watch in its technical, almost machine-like aesthetic and the use of full lume on the dial so you can see it at night. There's also gorgeous contrast with this silver dial that you don't necessarily get with a darker dial. And as an example, I want to highlight the moon phase indication at 6 o'clock. The moon phase has been called the most romantic of complications, and while I would argue that the minute repeater gives it a run, there's no doubt that from a visual standpoint, the moon phase has it over all the others. That gorgeous, lustrous moon with the brilliant reflective stars next to it inset in a midnight, almost navy blue type of lacquer is absolutely gorgeous, and it stands out better against a silvered base than it would against a darker dial. So that's one advantage of silver over all the dark dial options that are more typical of the Royal Oak continuity and the Royal Oak history. Now, a perpetual calendar, it is an Audemars Piguet 2802 module on a JLC 920 base, or as Audemars Piguet calls it, the caliber 2120. Now this is a caliber 2120/4 variant, and I want to clear up some misconceptions. This is an in-house movement. Audemars Piguet originally funded the development of this movement in the late 60s along with Patek Philippe and Vacheron, but today AP possesses the sole rights as well as the equipment to make this movement. They've continued its development far beyond the basic work done by JLC. Between the engineering, the fabrication, assembly, and the finish, this is entirely AP's movement, but it remains a masterpiece. One of the thinnest automatic calibers ever made. You can see some of the specific engineering features that have made it so successful and relatively robust in spite of its thinness. Now you can see the winding rotor, fully engraved, skeletonized with all of the spider-like gossamer arms of the cantilever actually engraved by hand. The important thing to remember about this winding system is that it is 360 degrees. That is, the winding mass itself runs all the way around, highlighted by a 21-karat gold piece that's asymmetrically placed, but there is an annular ring-based system. So That ring that you see just under my finger is part of the central winding rotor, and rather than having the mass rotate around above that ring, the ring is actually the platform on which the mass rotates. Underneath the ring are 4 ruby rollers that support it so that it doesn't bend, flex, or move with undue violence when the watch is on the wrist. So you have that offset mass of the 21 karat gold, and then you have this rail that rides on ruby rollers, and that is actually set in the same plane as the bridges and the balance cock that you see here, meaning that when you turn the watch on its side, the winding mass itself is actually as high off the base plate of the movement as the bridges and the cocks themselves. So it's almost like you've sunken the winding mass so that it's hooked over the outside of the movement and riding on that circular track itself placed on the ruby rollers. Now the balance is a gyromac style, so free sprung with variable inertia balance masses on the outer circumference. Those little masses, they're C-shaped, they're a bit asymmetrical, can be turned to increase or decrease the moment of inertia, and that's how the watchmaker regulates the timepiece. With the free-sprung balance, you don't have to worry about shock or movement displacing a winding stick or a stick index that would typically be used to tension or slightly detension the hairspring. So you've got the luxury of a measure of durability and chronometric precision engineered into what is an ultra-fine, ultra-thin automatic winding movement. Now, exceptionally complex, 38 joules, 343 parts. It has a 40-hour power reserve, and it does use bidirectional winding. It operates at an unconventional 19,800 vibrations per hour, and again, it is considered to be one of the all-time great movements. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about engraving. In addition to being a fine example of engineering and watchmaking from a technical standpoint, this is a work of art in its own right. Now, this rotor is entirely engraved. When you get very close to it, you can see that there is writing into it describing adjustment for isochronism, multiple temperatures, multiple positions, and the skeleton-like web of supports branching out to the gold winding mass features detail that is intricate, almost reminiscent of the balance cock of a longa or the case of a Linda Verdlin tattoo. Fantastic to see at close range, spectacular in the photos on our website. Everything about this movement, from the radial dressage on the crown wheel and the ratchet wheel, the Côte de Genève on the plates, the mirror-polished anglage and découverture of the screw and jewel sinks. It is an absolute masterpiece in every sense. From the craft perspective, not just the engineering perspective, this is something that will stand up to the best of Geneva, this will stand up to the best of Saxony. This is finishing at the absolute highest level. This watch, with an original retail of almost $70,000, represents outstanding value today. This is one of those watches that will not lose value going forward. It has heirloom quality such that you could pass it to your son, your son's son, or a succession of daughters for that matter. Anyone can appreciate the beauty, the warmth, and the endearing humanity of this Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Perpetual Calendar, reference 26252OR, with ultra-thin movement, dial by Stern, case by Audemars Piguet, designed by Gerald Genta. This is a rare example of a true gem, and you can see it in high-resolution images on our website, watchyouwant.com.